I was 28 years old the morning everything changed, and I didn't know it yet. That's the honest truth of it. No premonition, no tightening in the gut. I woke up in a narrow bunk in the Dayton worker block same as every other morning, the smell of recycled air and machine grease, the distant hum of the fabrication lines warming up 3 kilometers east. My arm glowed faintly in the dark. Green. Always green unless you were down to hours and then it turned red, and red meant you were already as good as dead. I had 19 hours, 42 minutes. Enough for the shift. Enough for dinner, not much else. My mother was already up. She was making coffee on the hot plate, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake me, even though I was already awake and had been for 20 minutes, watching the ceiling. She did that every morning. 43 years of careful movements in a small space. She'd never had more than 3 days on her clock in her entire adult life, and she moved like a woman who understood in her bones that nothing was guaranteed. Morning, I said. Morning, she didn't turn around. Shift starts at 6. I know. She set a mug on the table. The coffee was bad, it always was, but it was hot, and hot mattered in Dayton in February. I sat up and looked at the clock strip on the wall, the one my father had mounted there before he died. Old habit. The numbers on it matched my arm. 19 hours, 38 minutes. I thought about my father sometimes in those early morning minutes before the shift took over. He'd been a quiet man, methodical, the kind of worker the plant supervisors liked because he showed up and didn't ask questions. He died when I was 9, not from anything dramatic. He'd simply run short. A payment he'd miscalculated, a rate adjustment he hadn't been notified of in time, and then a morning when his clock hit 0 at the workbench, and that was the end of him. His supervisor had filed a productivity loss report. The sector authority had processed his final wage and applied it to the outstanding balance on his account. My mother and I had received a notification. The system had no mechanism for grief. It wasn't designed to account for it. You lost time when someone died, not because the system took it, but because you kept living in a world that still required payment and you were still required to meet it. And grief cost hours you couldn't afford. My mother had understood that in a way that I had taken years to understand myself. She had grieved my father quickly and quietly and gotten back to the arithmetic, because the arithmetic didn't stop. That was what 19 hours looked like from the inside. That was the texture of it. I drank the coffee. I went to work. I didn't know that by that time the next morning my mother would be dead. I would be hunted by custodian enforcement across 3 sector boundaries, and everything I had believed about the world, about who built it, who designed it, and why, would be ash. The custodians came to Earth 400 years ago, or so the school books said. I had no reason to doubt the school books then. They arrived quietly in vessels we didn't detect until they were already in orbit, and they didn't come with weapons drawn. That was what the histories always emphasized. They came with open hands. They came with gifts. The gift was the modification. They called it a biological harmonization, a benevolent intervention. The technical language was dense enough that most people didn't read past the first paragraph. What it meant in plain terms was this: they altered the human genome at the germline level, across the entire species simultaneously, within a single generation. Children born after the arrival aged normally until 25. At 25, the biological clock stopped. The body locked. Youth forever, or as close to forever as biology could manage. The catch, and there was always a catch, was that the alteration came bundled with a regulator. Embedded in the left forearm, grown from modified tissue rather than implanted by surgery, invisible from the outside but glowing faintly green through the skin when you knew where to look. The regulator controlled the second half of the modification. Because the custodians had also, in the same elegant genetic edit, removed the human body's ability to sustain itself past a certain metabolic threshold without external input. Not food, not oxygen, something finer than that. Something they called chronological energy, which translated in the street to simply time. Time was now currency. Time was now survival. The regulator counted it down, second by second, and when it reached 0, the body failed. Fast. Total systemic shutdown, 5 seconds from 0 to gone. It looked peaceful from the outside, they said. It was not peaceful from the inside, according to the accounts of people who had come back from the edge. The custodians distributed time through a system of banks, employers, and sector authorities. Work, and you were paid in time. Buy goods, and you spent time. Cross a sector boundary from a low zone to a high zone, and you paid a toll in time. Miss a payment and the collectors came, which was as close to fair warning as the system ever gave you. And fair warning in Dayton usually meant 12 hours to settle your account or start saying goodbye. The custodians themselves were outside the system. They didn't need time the way we did. Their biology was different, older, slower, immune to the regulator's logic. They lived for what appeared to be centuries. They staffed the administrative bodies, the sector enforcement bureaus, and the Continental Time Authority, which was the closest thing to a government that existed anymore. Below them sat a human enforcement layer. The keepers, we called them, men and women recruited from the higher sectors who wore gray coats and carried chronological transfer rods, and had the authority to seize time from anyone who couldn't account for where they got it. And below the keepers sat the rest of us. I was not political then. I want to be clear about that. I went to work at the fabrication plant. I came home, I ate, I slept, and I gave most of the time I earned right back to the sector authority for rent and power, and the privilege of breathing recycled air in a block that smelled like grease and old plastic. I didn't spend energy on anger because anger cost time, and time was something I didn't have to waste. What I had was Boral. Boral had been my closest friend since we were 12 years old and had gotten into a fight over a food voucher in the sector distribution line. We lost the voucher. We split a bloody lip between us and walked home laughing about it. He was solid, Boral, big-shouldered, easy-tempered, the kind of man who made the shift feel shorter just by being there. He had a wife named Greta and a son who was 4 years old and already asking questions about the green glow on his arm. Boral lived for that boy. I didn't have anyone else. My father had died when I was 9, timed out at work, short on payment, which was how half the deaths in Dayton happened. No drama, just arithmetic. My mother and I had managed since then the way people in Dayton managed, carefully, day by day, never planning more than 48 hours ahead because planning further than that was its own kind of grief. The night it changed, I was on my way home from a late shift when I heard the noise from the alley off Sector 4 Main. 3 men had a 4th man backed against a wall. The 3 were Minutemen. That was what the sector called the freelance time thieves who operated in the gray spaces between keeper jurisdiction. They wore their allegiance openly, a strip of red on the left wrist, just above the regulator. Their method was simple and brutal. They grabbed your arm, they physically forced the transfer, and they took what you had. The keepers rarely bothered with Minutemen cases unless the theft was large enough to flag the sector ledger. In Dayton, it was almost never large enough. The 4th man was not from Dayton. That was clear from 15 meters away. His clothes were wrong, too clean, too well fitted, nothing that had been repaired 6 times and would be repaired 6 more. His regulator glowed differently too, a steadier, deeper green that you only saw in the high sectors, which meant he had time on him the way Dayton people had rent debt on them. A lot, and for a long time. I should have kept walking. That's not self-criticism. It's just the truth. In Dayton you kept walking because stopping cost you, and I had 19 hours and a mother to get back to. I didn't keep walking. I don't know precisely why. Something in the man's face, maybe the look of a person who has run out of angles, who has spent too long in a room where every door is locked and has only just realized it. Not fear, something quieter than fear. Acceptance almost. I put myself between him and the Minutemen. There was a short, unpleasant conversation. Then there was a shorter, more unpleasant confrontation. And then there were 3 Minutemen moving away quickly and 1 stranger standing in the alley, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. His name was Hamilton. Henry Hamilton. He was, he told me, 105 years old, though he looked no older than I did, which was the modification's strange mercy. He had more time on his arm than I had ever seen on a person outside the high sector feeds, and he had come to Dayton deliberately, he said, because he was tired. We sat in a corner booth in a place that served bad food and strong liquor, and was open all night because Dayton ran 3 shifts. Hamilton talked for 2 hours. He had a measured way of speaking, the kind of cadence that came from having had time, actual time, years and decades of it, to think through what you wanted to say before you said it. He told me things I had suspected but never said aloud, about the custodians, about the system. The modification wasn't benevolence. It had never been benevolence. The custodians were resource managers. That was the most honest way to put it. They had found in humanity a species with enormous productive and creative capacity, and they had modified that species to produce something the custodians needed. The chronological energy wasn't just currency. It was fuel. It was harvest. Every moment of time that ticked off a Dayton regulator was energy that moved upward through the sector system, through the high zones, through the Continental Authority, to the custodians themselves, who consumed it in ways their biology required, and human biology could not fully perceive or measure. Hamilton had spent years, decades, trying to understand the mechanics of it. He was a careful man, precise in his thinking, and he had not arrived at these conclusions quickly or easily. He had watched the system for a century. He had paid attention. He had tracked the yield data that the Continental Authority published annually, the aggregate chronological figures that were presented as economic indicators, but that, if you read them alongside the custodian population records and the sector-by-sector mortality rates, told a different story. The system was not an accident of human economics. It was not the result of ordinary greed or political failure or the kind of institutional drift that produces bad outcomes from well-intentioned designs. It had been engineered, precisely, patiently, by minds that operated on timescales that made human political cycles look like weather events. The custodians had been here for 400 years. They had not spent that time observing. They had spent that time managing, and the management had been thorough. The sector structure, the regulator design, the rate-setting mechanism, the keeper enforcement layer, humans recruited from the low sectors, loyal to the system because the system was the only path out of the low sectors. Every element interlocked. Every element served the yield calculation. It was, Hamilton said, the most elegant long-term resource extraction system he had encountered in his reading of whatever histories the authority had allowed to survive from the pre-arrival period. I listened to all of this and tried to locate, inside myself, whatever I felt about it. What I found was not rage, exactly, though rage was there. It was something more fundamental. The sensation of a man who has been living in a building and has just been shown the blueprints, and the blueprints reveal that the building was designed to fail in a specific, scheduled way, and the failure was always going to happen, and the only question was whether you were inside when it did. The system had been designed to keep Dayton at the exact threshold of survivability. Not below it, dead workers didn't produce. Not above it, comfortable workers developed the dangerous habit of making choices. Right at the line. Right at the point where the only thing in your mind from the moment you woke until the moment you slept was the number on your arm. My mother had lived at that line for 43 years. Hamilton poured another drink. He had been drinking steadily since we sat down, which given his clock was either a very long final evening or a very practiced relationship with his own limits. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you stopped," he said. "In the alley you didn't have to stop." "I had enough to stop." "No one in Sector 4 has enough to stop. That's the design." He looked at his drink. "Your father died when you were 9. I didn't ask how he knew. He had the manner of a man who had prepared for this conversation. "The system killed him," I said. "Yes, And your mother has been paying his debt for 19 years because the transfer of outstanding balance to the surviving dependent was written into the sector authority charter in the 3rd year after arrival, before any human government had recovered enough coherence to read the fine print. He set down the glass. The custodians are thorough. The system had been designed to keep Dayton at the exact threshold of survivability. That was what I took away from Hamilton's 2 hours. Not the specific details of the yield calculation, not the technical architecture of the modification, just that. The threshold had been calculated. The threshold was maintained. The people living at the threshold, my mother, Boral, and Greta, the 4-year-old boy who would grow up with a glow on his arm and a deficit he hadn't accrued, they were not unfortunate. They were the product of a design. That distinction mattered to me. It still matters to me. There is a specific kind of anger that comes from understanding that your situation is not circumstance but intention. It is colder than ordinary anger. It is more patient. It does not require a target to be present. It simply waits. He was a man who had carried knowledge for 100 years, and eventually came to the conclusion that the only useful thing left to do with it was transfer it to someone still young enough to be angry. He pressed his arm to mine before I was fully asleep. I felt the transfer in my half-consciousness as a warmth that was both strange and specific, like putting your hand on a surface that has been in sunlight for hours. Then nothing. Then morning. Then the green light on my arm that burned like an accusation. He had given me everything he had. Every day, every hour, every minute of a life he'd been living for longer than anyone in Dayton had ever lived. And he had simply handed it across and walked out into the dark and given the system its final second. I sat in that booth for a long time, long enough for the night shift to end and the morning shift to start, long enough for the weight of what I was holding to become real. Then I went to find my mother. I found Boral first. He was already at the plant gate, waiting for his shift card to clear. When I grabbed his arm and he saw the glow on mine, his face went through about 4 different things in 2 seconds. "What happened?" he said. I told him, fast and low, standing at the gate with the morning crowd moving past us. He listened the way Boral always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the kind of stillness that meant he was filing everything away. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Will," he said, "you understand what they'll do if they find that on you?" "I know. The keepers will call it theft. They'll confiscate the whole amount. I know." I pressed a decade into his arm before he could finish the sentence. His regulator shifted. He looked at it, then at me. "That's 10 years, he said. 1 for each year I've known you. I want you and Greta and your boy to have room. Don't spend it fast. Don't flash it, just have room." I gripped his shoulder. "I need to go find my mother." He was going to say something else. I could see it on his face, something practical and worried and probably correct. But he let me go. I took the cross-sector line toward the residential block where my mother lived, 7 stops east. I was thinking about what I would say to her. I was thinking that we could cross into a better sector, maybe sector 6 or 7, somewhere with clean air and a food supply that wasn't timed to the quarter hour. I was thinking about the expression on Hamilton's face in the alley, that deep, used-up acceptance, and trying to understand what it cost to know what he knew for as long as he knew it. I was not thinking about the keepers. I should have been. Keeper Leon was waiting at the residential block entrance. He was a tall man, gray-coated, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over a long career, to let people come to him. He had a cadre of 4 with him, but he'd sent them to the far corners of the block, a deliberate choice, I realized later. He wanted to take me alone, or at least make it look that way. He held a scanner that was already reading the ambient chronological signature from 20 meters out, and his face, when I stepped off the transport, told me it was already reading mine. "Will Salas," he said, not a question. "Keeper Leon, you have an unusual amount of time on your arm for a factory worker from Sector 4. I earned it." He looked at me the way the keepers looked at everyone in Dayton, with the particular patience of a man who knows the arithmetic is on his side. Hamilton is dead. He was found this morning, timed out. The authority logged his chronological transfer at 0340. 114 years, give or take. He gave it to me. That's what theft always sounds like. He took a step toward me. I'm going to need to process this, Mr. Salas. The authority will review the transfer record and make a determination. In the meantime, you'll take it. I held his gaze. And the determination will go whichever way keeps the high zones comfortable. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like recognition, the look of a man who has heard an accusation he cannot quite dismiss. He recovered quickly. The scanner came up. I made a decision in about half a second. I ran. I know how it sounds. Running from a keeper is the single fastest way to turn a processing inquiry into a full warrant, and a full warrant in Dayton was as close to a death sentence as the system offered, because a keeper with a warrant could seize your regulator outright, and a seized regulator meant your clock stopped. Period. But the alternative was standing there, while Leon took 114 years from my arm, and filed a report that would close the case neatly, and leave Hamilton's testimony exactly nowhere. So I ran, and Leon, to his credit, was fast. I will not go through every detail of those next 12 hours. The chase across 3 sectors. The keeper pursuit vehicles, gray and silent, sliding through streets that cleared ahead of them because nobody in Dayton wanted to be standing near a man with a full warrant when the keepers caught up to him. I moved. I kept moving. I ducked into a fabrication sublevel I knew from 3 years working the plant, through a drainage channel, up through a ventilation block into Sector 6 residential. I was bleeding from a cut above my eye and running on adrenaline and 112 years of borrowed life when I finally crossed the boundary into the high sectors. New Greenwich was a different planet. That sounds like an exaggeration. It wasn't. The air was different actually, measurably different, cleaner, scrubbed, and temperature-controlled, the kind of air that costs time to produce and nobody in Dayton ever breathed. The buildings were different. The streets were different. Even the people moved differently, slower, unhurried, with the particular ease of those who have never had to calculate whether they could afford to stop walking for 30 seconds. No one looked at their arms. That was the thing that struck me first. In Dayton, you checked your arm the way you checked your heartbeat, instinctively, constantly, because the number on your arm was the most important number in your life, and it was always going down. Here, no one checked. The numbers were high enough that they'd become abstract. The kind of wealth that stops being wealth and starts being just the texture of existence. I cleaned myself up in a public facility that cost 6 months to use, which I paid without blinking, which was its own strange feeling. I found clothes that didn't read as Sector 4. I moved carefully through a city that felt like it had been designed specifically to make people like me feel like trespassers. I found the casino by the simple logic that it was the largest lit building in the district, and large lit buildings in high sectors were where the time moved. His name was Ways, Philippe Ways. He was seated at the main table with 4 other men who had the particular quality of the very old rich, not old in body, never old in body, but old in manner, in the way they held themselves, in the specific gravity of their attention. He had a daughter named Sylvia who stood at the edge of the room and watched everything with dark, careful eyes that suggested she understood the room more clearly than she was supposed to. I sat down at the table. I put up years. I played cards. I want to say there was some brilliant plan. There wasn't. I was running on anger and grief and the image of my mother's face that morning, and somewhere in the back of my mind was Hamilton's voice, steady and measured and wholly without hope, explaining why Dayton was the way it was and would always be the way it was unless someone decided the arithmetic was wrong. I won. Not everything, but enough, more than a century off the table, paid out in sealed transfer capsules that clinked against each other in my jacket pocket like small, dense promises. Waze watched me collect with an expression of mild, evaluative interest, the way you'd watch an interesting insect navigate a maze. "You play like a man who has nothing to lose," he said. "I play like a man who finally has something to gain." I met his eyes, which amounts to the same thing. His daughter was still watching me from across the room. Leon found me at the casino. He was alone this time, which surprised me. He came through the main floor with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent enough time in enough rooms to make any room feel like his jurisdiction. He confiscated the capsules from the table. He didn't touch the ones already in my jacket. I realized later he didn't know about those. "You'll come with me," he said. Sylvia Ways moved before I could. I don't know what she told herself in that moment. I know what she told me later, that she had been watching the sector feeds for years, watching the numbers, understanding in an abstract way that the comfort of New Greenwich was subtracted from somewhere, but never quite allowing herself to follow the subtraction to its conclusion. I know that something in that casino, maybe the sight of Leon's expression when he looked at me, maybe the memory of something her father had said once that she had filed away unexamined, had caused a door inside her to open. She created a distraction. I moved. We ended up in a service corridor together, and then outside, and then in a vehicle moving south toward the sector line. "You are going to lose," she said. "Yes." "You have something in your jacket." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, watching the city move past the window. "My father owns a time lending operation in Sector 4, she said. "He sets the rates." "I know." "He's never been to Sector 4. I looked at her. She was 25 years old and had been 25 for long enough that she'd stopped being surprised by it, which meant she'd been in New Greenwich for a while. But her eyes were doing something I hadn't expected. They were actually seeing, in the particular way that requires deciding, deliberately, to look at what's been in front of you all along. "I want to show you something," I said. I never made it to my mother in time. I need to say that plainly, because I've told this story enough times to know that people want the timeline to be different, want there to have been some near miss, some heroic sprint, some second left on the clock. There wasn't. The message from the sector authority came through on a public terminal while Sylvia and I were still crossing the boundary back into Dayton. My mother had given the last of her time to a sector debt she didn't owe, a rate increase that had been filed that morning without notification, the kind of administrative adjustment that happened to Dayton accounts every few months, a small correction in the ledger that nobody in New Greenwich ever felt, but that, in a place where people lived on hours, landed like a blade. She had tried to take the cross-sector transport home and hadn't had enough to cover the fare increase. The transport records showed she had walked instead. She had been approximately 400 meters from the residential block when her clock reached 0. She was 50 years old. She had lived her entire adult life in Sector 4. She had never had more than 3 days on her arm. I stood at the terminal and read the record, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't grief. Exactly. Grief was what I'd had when my father died, that raw, undefended kind of pain. This was different. This was colder. This was the feeling of a man who has been carrying an explanation in his back pocket and has just found the thing the explanation explains. Sylvia stood beside me and didn't say anything. She understood, I think, that there was nothing to say. I made some decisions standing there. The first, I was not going to run from Leon anymore. Running was a debt maintenance strategy. It assumed the ledger was legitimate and you were just trying to stay on it. I was done with that assumption. The second, Ways lending operation had vaults, 11 of them across 4 sectors. They stored sealed time capsules, the long-duration ones, the 1,000-year and 100-year deposits that the high-sector families used to store surplus. I knew this because Hamilton had known it, and Hamilton had told me, and Hamilton's knowledge was now the only inheritance I had left that wasn't going to be seized. The third, if you flood a system with what it's been rationing, you don't just disrupt the economy, you break the leverage, and leverage was the only thing keeping Dayton on its knees. Sylvia Ways was her father's daughter in every practical way. She knew the vault locations. She knew the security architecture. She knew the sector access codes because she had spent 20 years watching her father move through the world and absorbing information the way people who are bored but observant always do, thoroughly, without intending to. "If we do this," she said, on the second night, in a rented room in Sector 4 that I'd paid for with 6 months of Hamilton's legacy, "we can't undo it." "I know. My father's operation provides time to people in the low sectors. If we drain the vaults, he'll raise the rates to compensate. He'll push the burden down. He always does." She was quiet. "We're not disrupting his operation," I said. "We're ending it. There's a difference." I looked at her. "The question isn't whether it's reversible. The question is whether it's right." She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "My grandfather started the lending business. He told me once that it was a service, that people needed time and the lending house provided it." "Did he tell you where the time came from?" "No." "Did you ever ask?" A longer silence. "No," she said, "I didn't." The first vault was in Sector 3, behind a facade that read as a standard financial processing center. We went in through a maintenance access that Sylvia knew about because she'd once had to collect a transfer from a manager who was too discreet to do it at the main entrance. The security was calibrated for keeper-level threats, meaning it assumed anyone attempting access would be working alone, under economic pressure, and unaware of the internal layout. We were none of those things. We took 11,000 years out of that first vault in sealed capsules packed into transit cases. We drove out in a vehicle that Sylvia's clearance kept clear of keeper checkpoints. We stopped twice in Sector 4 residential zones on the way back, and at each stop, I walked into the crowded common areas and put sealed capsules on tables and counters, and into the hands of the people standing nearest to me, and said the same thing each time. "Don't ask where this came from. Don't hold it. Give away what you can't use. Don't let them take it back." The looks on those faces. I have carried those looks for every year since. Not joy exactly. Something more complicated than joy, the expression of a person who has been running a deficit so long that the concept of surplus doesn't register immediately, requires a moment to process, and then lands somewhere deep and specific, and nothing like what you would expect from a person who has just received a gift. More like recognition, like being told you were right about something you'd been afraid to believe. We did 4 more vaults in the next 6 days. The second vault was in Sector 5, behind a time-lending office that did a brisk trade in short-term loans to Sector 4 workers who needed to cover rate spikes. The loan terms were posted in the front window in small print, the kind of small print that exists precisely so that you can say it was disclosed. The rates were structured so that if you borrowed a week to cover a rate adjustment, you paid back 10 days. If you paid back those 10 days with another loan, you paid back 16. The math ran in one direction only, and the direction was down. I had borrowed from an operation like that when I was 19, and it had taken me 2 years to work back to zero. I remembered the loan officer's face, not unkind, not cruel, the face of a person doing a job that someone had designed, processing transactions that a system had made necessary. I had not blamed him then, and I did not blame him now. The system was not made of villains. It was made of slots, and every person in it, from the loan officer to the keeper to the factory foreman to my mother counting her hours against the rent. Every one of them was in a slot, doing what the slot required. The only people who weren't in a slot were the ones who had enough time that the concept of a slot became optional. Ways, his associates. The dozen or so high-sector families who had been compounding their chronological surplus for generations, whose time was so far past the point of counting that they had long since stopped thinking of it as survival currency, and now thought of it the way people with inherited land think of property, as simple fact, as background, as the unremarkable condition of their existence. We took 80,000 years out of Vault 2. It took 40 minutes and 3 transit cases. The third vault was harder, Sector 6, better security, keeper clearance required at the outer door. Sylvia talked us through it. She had a quality I hadn't fully recognized in the casino, a kind of focused, tactical composure that I suspect she developed over years of being underestimated. People in New Greenwich had a habit of treating her as an extension of her father's presence rather than a person with her own assessment of the room. She had learned to use that. She talked to the security officer at the door with the relaxed authority of someone who had grown up in rooms like this one. She used her father's name not as a weapon but as a simple coordinate. Here is where I come from. This is context, not threat. The officer cleared us in 40 seconds. We were inside the vault in 3 minutes. Sector 4, the night after the third vault, was different. I had been moving too fast to pay close attention to what was happening on the ground, but Sylvia had been watching the sector feeds on the receiver while I drove. She told me. The distribution from the first 2 vaults had moved through the residential blocks like water through dry ground fast, and then settling, finding the low places. People who had had hours now had months. People who had had days now had years. Not everyone. The distribution was uneven, chaotic, nothing like the managed trickle of the system, but enough people, enough change in enough arms, that something was happening in Sector 4 that hadn't happened in a long time. People were not going to work. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough that the plant supervisors were filing absence reports, and the absence reports were flagging in the authority system, and the authority system was generating alerts about reduced sector productivity, which, and this was the part Sylvia explained to me with a careful, almost clinical precision, fed directly into the custodian yield calculation. The custodians noticed a productivity drop the same way they noticed everything, as a data point in an ongoing model. The model would adjust. Rates would compensate. The recalibration would begin. We both knew that. But the fact that it was happening, that a statistically significant number of Sector 4 workers had, for the first time in their working lives, enough time on their arms to wake up and make a choice about whether to show up, that was new. That was the thing the model didn't have a clean historical baseline for. I don't want to overstate what it meant. Those workers would need to eat. Their rent was still billed. The sector authority would adjust the rate within days, maybe hours. The window was narrow. But there was a window, and people were standing in it, and that mattered in ways I couldn't fully articulate then and still struggle to put into clean language now. It had something to do with what Hamilton had said about people believing things. Not hopping. Believing. The Sector 4 residential blocks had not been a place where people believed in the possibility of different arithmetic for a very long time. Now some of them were starting to. Leon was 2 steps behind us the whole time. I knew because Sylvia monitored the keeper dispatch channels on a modified receiver she'd sourced from a Sector 6 electronics trader who had asked no questions and charged accordingly. Leon was methodical. He didn't panic. Didn't overstep. Didn't fall for the obvious patterns. He found the first vault within 18 hours of our visit and spent 2 days tracing the distribution before he started building a picture of what we were actually doing. I respected him for it even then. He was good at his work. The problem, from his perspective, was that his work was built on an assumption the system had never questioned, that the people being managed would stay manageable. That subsistence anxiety would keep the arithmetic in his favor. It was, I thought, the same assumption the custodians had built into the original design. The modification made the body dependent. The dependency made people careful. Careful people didn't run the ledger in reverse. But there was something Hamilton had known that the custodians had apparently never fully modeled. Careful people, pushed past a certain point, stopped being careful. My mother had been careful her entire life. She had given away time she couldn't afford to spare to keep me and my father housed and fed and alive for as long as the arithmetic allowed. She had moved quietly through small spaces and never asked for more than she was given. She had been, by every measure, the system used to evaluate a person's acceptability, a compliant subject. She had died 400 meters from home because a rate adjustment had been filed without notification. The custodians had been running this system for 400 years. They had calculated the yield curves, the compliance thresholds, the exact point at which desperation produced maximum output without producing rebellion. They had been right as far as it went, but they had been optimizing for populations. They had not fully accounted for individuals. For the specific, unpredictable weight of a son watching a terminal record tell him where his mother's clock stopped. The Minutemen found us on day 7. Fortis, their leader, a broad man with the flat affect of someone who had made peace with doing ugly work, had been tracking the distribution the same way Leon had, except his methodology was simpler. Follow the free time, find the source, take the source. He had a dozen men and a scanner network that the keepers had never bothered to dismantle, because the Minutemen were, from the system's perspective, a useful tool for keeping Dayton's internal economy under pressure. They hid us in a parking structure in Sector 4 East, where we'd been loading the last of a transfer run. 2 vehicles blocked the exits. Fortis came out of the far stairwell with 8 men behind him, and the particular unhurried walk of a man who has the numbers. He said, "I'm going to need all of it." I said no. He smiled. He had been smiling since he came around the corner, which was a particular kind of professional affect. The smile that says the outcome of this conversation is already decided, and the only remaining question is whether the other party understands that yet. "You're going to run out eventually," he said. "Everyone runs out, that's the system." "The system," I said, "is the problem." He stopped smiling. "There is a technique for the arm transfer, the forced kind, the Minutemen kind, that requires you to grip your opponent's arm above the wrist and apply specific pressure at 2 points simultaneously. My father had taught it to me before he died. He'd learned it from his own father. In Dayton, you learned these things the way you learned everything, because there was no margin for not knowing. Fortis was bigger than me. He was probably stronger than me. What he wasn't was angrier than me, and anger, deployed correctly, is its own kind of precision. I won't describe the details. What matters is that I won, and Fortis lost, and what he lost in that parking structure was not just the fight. It was the thing he had come for, which was the leverage. You can't threaten a man with poverty who has already decided to spend everything he has. His men took him and left. Sylvia was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Not admiration, not horror, something more complicated, the look of a person recalibrating who they are standing next to. "Are you all right?" she said. "No," I looked at my arm, still green, still burning with years I hadn't earned. "But I'm not done." Way's primary vault was in New Greenwich, naturally. The largest one, the one that held the million-year capsule, the Central Reserve, the kind of surplus that existed not because anyone needed a million years, but because having it was, in itself, a form of power. The statement it made was the point. We have enough that we have never had to think about running out, and you have always had to think about running out, and that asymmetry is permanent. Getting into New Greenwich the second time required Sylvia, which was both the obvious truth and, I think, the thing that finally forced her to cross a line she had been standing at for a week. Her father's clearance code, her knowledge of the vault access protocol, her face, which the security system had logged as friendly for 25 years. We didn't speak much on the way in. There wasn't much to say. She had called her father twice since we'd started, both times to warn him, both times to give him the opportunity to do what no member of the high sector lending class had ever done voluntarily, which was open the vaults themselves. Both times he had declined. He had said, the second time, in a voice that I suspect he believed was measured but came across as a man talking to someone he has decided is no longer worth fully engaging. You might upset things for a generation, maybe two, but nothing will change. Everyone wants to live forever. They all believe they'll be the exception. Sylvia had hung up and not spoken for 40 minutes. Then she said, "He's wrong." "About which part?" "All of it." She stared at the road ahead. "Nobody in Dayton believes they'll be the exception. That's the part he's never understood. He thinks the system works because everyone secretly hopes they'll climb out of it. But people in Dayton don't hope that. They're too busy surviving to hope. She stopped. Just what? They just want enough room to live in. We went in through the residential access, past Way's house security, into the vault corridor that ran beneath the property. The capsule was in a sealed container the size of a cargo crate, behind a biometric lock that Sylvia's hand opened. I stood there and looked at it. 1 million years of chronological energy, stored in a crate in a basement under a house that belonged to a man who had never once set foot in Sector 4. 1 million years that had been extracted, second by second, from the arms of people who had 19 hours and a shift to get to. I picked it up. We were almost to the sector boundary when Leon's vehicle appeared behind us. He had run it tighter than I'd expected. He had tracked the entry, pulled Sylvia's clearance record, worked the timeline backward. He was in a standard keeper pursuit vehicle, alone, which told me either the authority hadn't authorized backup yet or he'd chosen not to ask for it. I didn't know which until later. It was the second thing. Leon had grown up in Dayton. That was the detail I hadn't known. He had pulled himself out of Sector 4 20 years ago on a keeper recruitment track, because it was the one path out that didn't require time you didn't have. The authority paid the cross-sector fees for new recruits, a calculated investment in enforcement loyalty. He had spent 2 decades enforcing a system he had understood, from the inside, for longer than most of the people who staffed the Continental Authority. He had kept enforcing it because the alternative, as he saw it, was chaos. And chaos in a system built on chronological dependency killed people the same way the system did, just less predictably. He believed in order the way a man who has grown up watching disorder destroys things believes in order, not abstractly, but with the particular conviction of someone who has paid for the lesson personally. I know all of this because he told me later, at the boundary. But before the boundary, there was the chase, and the chase was not clean. Leon had requisitioned a second pursuit unit on day 5, after we cleared Vault 4. He had also, quietly, pulled the Keeper deployment roster and identified which of his officers had grown up in the low sectors. He had reassigned them to administrative duties for the duration of the operation, which was the action of a man who understood, without saying it directly, that the people he was pursuing were doing something his officers might be unable to pursue with full commitment. That was not mercy on his part, or not primarily, it was professionalism. He needed people who would do the job cleanly. And people from Sector 4, who had just watched their neighbors wake up with years on their arms, were not those people. I respected that too. On day 6, he cut us off on the approach to Vault 7, in a freight corridor between Sectors 5 and 6. He had 3 vehicles and 6 officers, and he had positioned them well, blocking the forward exit, with a secondary unit on the cross corridor to the left, leaving us only the reversal route, which he had calculated we would not take because revering put us back towards Sector 4 without the vault contents. He was right that we wouldn't reverse. He was wrong about the reason. Sylvia had identified an overhead maintenance access, a legacy utility channel from before the current building stock went up, that ran through the wall above the freight corridor and came out in an adjacent loading bay. I am not a small man. The channel was not a comfortable fit. We went through it anyway, on our backs in the dark, with the sound of Leon's officers establishing their perimeter on the other side of the wall. And at some point in the middle of that particular misery, Sylvia started laughing, quietly, with her hand over her mouth, genuine helpless laughter at the specific absurdity of our situation. I looked at her in the dark and the glow of our arms, and I thought, she was 25 years old and had been 25 for a long time, and had lived her entire life in rooms that were designed to make her comfortable, and had never until recently needed a maintenance channel. And here she was. "What?" she whispered. "Nothing," I said. "Keep moving." We cleared the channel. We cleared Vault 7. We were back in Sector 4 before Leon's unit had finished debriefing. His vehicle ran out of time at the boundary marker. Literally, the pursuit vehicle's chronological fuel cell hit zero, because he had pushed the vehicle through 4 sectors without stopping to refuel, and keepers were allocated a certain fuel budget per shift, and he had exceeded it. The vehicle stopped. He got out. He had, by his own count, 3 minutes left on his personal clock. He had burned through his day chasing us and hadn't stopped to draw a reserve. He walked toward me. He wasn't reaching for his transfer rod. He wasn't calling backup. He walked the way a man walks when he has made a decision and is carrying it without breaking stride. I held the capsule against my chest and looked at him and waited. He stopped 6 feet away. "This won't fix it," he said. His voice was level. He was a man who had spent 20 years being level in difficult circumstances. "You understand that?" "I know. They'll recalibrate, raise rates, adjust the distribution model. In 5 years, Dayton will be exactly where it was." "Maybe. Then why?" I thought about my mother, about Hamilton's face in the alley, that deep, finished look of a man who had watched the arithmetic win for a century, and decided he wanted one thing done with what he had left. About Boral, who had a son who was 4 years old and already looking at the glow in his arm. "Because it changes what people know," I said. "Even if they take it back, and they will, or they'll try, people will know what it felt like to have enough room. You can't take that back once it's there. That's the one thing the system can't recalculate." Leon looked at me for a long moment. The clock on his arm was red. I could see it from where I stood. I pressed 2 years into his arm. He didn't stop me. He stood there and let it happen and didn't say anything. Then he stepped aside. We distributed the capsule in the Sector 4 central distribution point, a common space, open air, where the morning shift was just coming off and the night shift hadn't left yet. I cracked the seals myself and put the capsules into hands that had been empty for too long. Sylvia worked the other side of the space. We didn't announce anything. We didn't make speeches. There was nothing to say that the weight of a sealed capsule in a person's hand didn't say better. The custodian observers, stationed at the sector boundary in their observation posts, logged it within 4 minutes. I know because we monitored the authority frequency. There was a long pause on the channel, longer than any pause I'd ever heard, and then a brief exchange in the custodian administrative language, which the channel transcribed automatically into a flat, affectless English summary. The summary read, "Anomalous distribution event, Sector 4, duration capsules unregistered origin, volume significant, initiating recalibration assessment." Recalibration assessment. That was how they described it. The same language they would use for a pricing adjustment or a boundary fee revision. The same actuarial tone. What the summary did not say, because the custodian administrative language did not have the vocabulary for it, was what I saw in that square. An elderly woman, elderly in manner only, her body locked at 25 like every other body, but her posture carrying decades of careful, contracted movement, holding a capsule in both hands the way you hold something you're not certain is real, not opening it, not running the calculation on what it was worth against what she owed, just holding it. A man near the east side of the square sitting down on a transport bench and putting his face in his hands, not from grief, but from something that looked to me, from across the square, like the physical release of a weight that had been in place so long he had forgotten it was weight. 2 boys, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who had run in from the residential side when the word spread, standing at the edge of the distribution and watching with the wide, assessing attention of children who understand that something significant is happening without yet having the framework to name what that significance is. Those boys would grow up in a Dayton where something had been different once, where the arithmetic had run backward for 6 days, where the clocks had been green and the vaults had been opened, where a Sector 4 factory worker and a new Greenwich heiress had driven through 7 sectors in a borrowed vehicle and handed sealed capsules to people who'd never been handed anything without a repayment schedule attached. They would grow up knowing it was possible, even if the authority recalibrated, even if the rates adjusted, even if the system spent the next decade quietly clawing back what it had lost. Those 2 boys would have the memory. And memory was the thing the custodians had most consistently failed to account for in their yield models. Memory was not a chronological resource. It did not tick down. It could not be seized by a keeper with a transfer rod. It could not be adjusted by a rate notice filed without notification. It was the one thing that moved the other direction, that grew, with time, rather than diminishing. I had stood in that square and watched people hold sealed capsules for the first time in their lives, hold them and not immediately spend them, not immediately calculate what they owed, but simply stand there for a moment and hold the thing and understand, in whatever way a person understands the absence of an absence, that there was room. The custodians could recalibrate. They would. The system was old and patient and had survived disruptions before, probably, over 400 years of administration. The yield curves would shift. The rates would adjust. Some portion of what we had given would be clawed back through mechanisms subtle enough that most people would never trace the connection. But some of it would stay. And Leon was standing in Dayton, looking at the green glow on his arm, for the first time in a long time not counting down. I think about Hamilton most mornings still, not with grief, exactly, or not only with grief. He was a man who had carried knowledge for 100 years, and eventually came to the conclusion that the only useful thing left to do with it was transfer it to someone still young enough to be angry. He was not wrong. I think about my mother too. The 400 meters, the rate adjustment filed without notification, the transport fare she couldn't cover. I think about the specific, ordinary cruelty of a system that doesn't require anyone to be deliberately cruel, that produces cruelty as a byproduct of optimization, the way a fabrication plant produces waste heat, without malice, without intention, as a simple consequence of the process running as designed. The custodians were not evil. I have thought about this for long enough to be sure of it. They were managers. They had found a resource and built an extraction system and run it for 4 centuries with the calm efficiency of beings who had never, not once, needed to check the clock on their arm and calculate whether they had enough left to get home. That was the gap. That was the thing no amount of recalibration could model accurately. What it does to a person, to a species, to be the thing being managed. What it produces, eventually, in the specific human configuration of grief and anger and love and spite, and the particular stubbornness of a son who decides that the arithmetic is wrong. We were still running. Sylvia and I, there were more vaults in more sectors, and the authority had warrants on both of us now, and Leon was complicated, in ways I didn't fully understand yet but was beginning to. But the square in Sector 4 was full of people standing still for a moment, holding what they had, breathing air that still wasn't clean enough, in a city that was still wrong in most of the ways that mattered. They were standing still, not running, not calculating, just standing there for a few minutes in the unfamiliar country of having enough. I had given them that, we had given them that. The custodians would recalibrate. But for now in Sector 4, the clocks were green. And for now, that was enough to keep going.